So why don't we get started then? And I can welcome you back to week number 3 in the Geo-Python course. Unfortunately, Kamyar is sick, so he won't be able to join us today. So you're stuck with me for the entire lecture part. But I suppose we can have a quick look at how things went during week number 2. And I had a request from someone just to go over using the GitHub plugin in Jupyter Lab, since we didn't get to do that during class. And I know some people were having issues with it. I thought we could go through that quickly as we get started. And then we'll get into our lecture material for this week about loops and conditional statements, which will allow us to do a bit more with what we've been learning in the code that we've seen thus far in the course. But you can see here fairly long list of things that were learned during week number 2. That's great to see. Of course, our focus was mainly on things like Python lists and something about version control. So those are things that show up here a bit more than other topics. So lists and tuples, how to use the Git plugin. So it's good that some people learned how to use that. How to use terminal to push things to GitHub, which, yeah, it's not necessarily the way we wanted to do things, but the way that we had to last week on Monday. And yeah, I think this looks like it's fairly representative. Sort commands, zip functions, and f strings, those are all handy things. I don't think we taught the .extend, but I guess we did teach .append. And there are several other list methods that we didn't introduce. So it's possible that you also then went looking for your own interest to find more things about Python lists and some of the material we covered during class. So that's good. I'm perhaps more interested in knowing how things are going with Git. And this looks, based just on kind of a quick glance at the comments that are here, this looks pretty much like what we've been seeing for the instructors in Discord as well. So it seems like some people are doing fine with it and everything is working, and then for others, it's either not going well or you're not sure whether it's working, which is why we want to go over with the time in the start of the class today. We want to go over how this GitHub plugin operates and how to know whether what you've done has actually been pushed to GitHub, and to make sure that, for instance, your assignments are submitted. It's good to understand how to check that everything's working properly. I would say that this sentiment here, I'm frustrated with Git, is not unusual. So I think for a lot of people, when they start using Git, they find it confusing. I came from using a different version control software, and I found using Git confusing, even though I was very familiar with version control. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. Once you get the hang of it, it's very, very, I wouldn't say intuitive, but it becomes kind of natural how to use it as you practice with it. And you'll see as you get later in the course and get more familiar with everything about the course environment that using Git is also maybe not so bad. But at the beginning, I certainly understand it's confusing to kind of understand where things are moving and in terms of files being transferred and all of that. So we'll have a look at that. Then about the programming pairs, there's a few things here. Looks like there's some good feedback so far. And I think that this is generally nice to see that people find having a partner useful. I think certainly for things like this, like making mistakes and having someone just catch them, you can save yourself a lot of time when you're learning to program just by having somebody catch the little typos that you make. And then you don't spend 20 or 30 minutes just trying to figure out why something that looks like it should work doesn't work because you can't see, the comma instead of a period or something like that. Those things can be very frustrating. So that's part of the reason why we like to do this. But there are also challenges like this. People still don't have a partner. I know at least one person had contacted us in Discord to try to sort out getting a new partner, and then the new partner didn't respond to their message. So we're working on it for those who are struggling with your partner issues. Maybe just come talk to me at the break, and we'll try to make sure that everybody's got a responsive partner, because one of the things that's difficult is that some people sign up for the course and then they drop it after a week or two, and then you have these kind of orphaned partners. So we can do our best to fix that. We just need to know who's in the situation they need a partner, because often there's more than one person and it's easy to make a new group. Regarding the question here, can both accept the GitHub Classroom exercise? Absolutely. So this is not a problem at all. The only thing to be aware of is that we only grade the driver's exercise. So if you're the navigator or whatever some week and you want to do the exercise yourself, or you just want to make your own copy of it, that's totally fine. We're just not going to look at it. So if you wanted, for instance, to show a question to one of the course assistants in the help sessions, that's also fine, even if you're not the driver. But it's just for grading purposes, we only grade the driver each week. And then the question, is there a way to modify a returned exercise if you notice a mistake afterwards? I mean, in essence, yes. If it's after the deadline for submission, I would say that you can modify it, but it does get flagged as late in the GitHub Classroom thing if you modify it after the deadline. So once you've kind of pushed your changes in GitHub, you can continue to push and update things as long as you want up until the deadline. If you find something after the deadline, maybe it's best if you want just to contact us and check that, is it okay if I fix something, I found a mistake. Most of the time we're pretty lenient with those things, but if you do it without saying something to us, then it does look like it was submitted late. We don't go back and check to see like when all of your commits were made in GitHub. It's just only the last one that appears, and then the GitHub Classroom thing puts a little red late I don't know, icon or something next to your submission. So we would see it as looking like it's late. So just maybe if you want to modify something and you find a mistake, just check with us to make sure first. But otherwise, I mean, in terms of like when you submitted your exercise, it's just the last push that you made in GitHub that is your submission. So you're always able to make more changes and push your changes again. In fact, it's a really good habit to push changes when you finish some part of the exercise rather than waiting until you get all the way done with all the problems and pushing everything at once. It's much better to kind of go incrementally. So if you finish part of problem one and you're happy with it, just make a commit and push that change and then continue working. It's just better because if you want to go back and undo something, if you break something in what you've done later on when you're tinkering with your code, the more that you have pushed earlier, the better the record is of what has changed in the past. And you might know, okay, well, I know it worked back when I pushed the first change to problem one, and now it doesn't work. Then you have a way to go back and find your issues. But yeah, question. Yeah, okay, so yeah, we've had this issue before. I think we have some suggestion on the course page about how to handle this, but I can't remember. I think the last year's class, we had some issues with being able to cache the credentials. In principle, you should be able to cache them so that you don't have to put your personal access token every single time you want to push, pull, or clone something. We can have a quick look at it and see if it's working based on the instructions on the course page. But otherwise, we can check and see what the sort of suggestion is from the GitHub documentation, because it should be possible to cache this so that you don't have to type it every time. We certainly don't want that to be like the reason why you don't want to push things just because it's like inconvenient. Because in most cases, when you're working on your own computer, pushing things to GitHub, I mean, I never get prompted for any password or anything like this. It just has my personal access token stored in memory and it's able to be used. So we should be able to find a solution for that. But that's good for us to know about. But, yeah, so anyway, I think this looks pretty much representative of how things have gone, for the past years in terms of how things went during week 2. Are there any other questions or anything like that at this point? Okay, so why don't we then do this? I'm going to go make myself get logged in here and open up Jupyter Lab in the CSC notebooks, or CSC Nope as it's now called. So I'm going to launch my instance. If you haven't done this yet, you can do the same. But let's just quickly go through the process of cloning an exercise from GitHub and pushing a change to it using the GitHub plugin so that you can see how things should work. And maybe even just going through this process might help explain some of the problems you might have encountered. So I'm here in the Nope platform. I'm going to go into the My Work folder, which is here. And at least for me, how I normally organize things, I just have this notebooks repository for our lesson notebooks, and I just put all my exercises directly in this folder here. So like here's the exercise 1 that we cloned last week. And I'm going to go then, I guess I have opened the tab for exercise 2, which I can make a little bit bigger. I'm going to grab the location of it from GitHub, copy this to the clipboard, and then go back to Jupyter Lab, where I can now go to the Git plugin on the left side here. So what I want to do is clone a repository because I've already made my copy of exercise 2 using the link from the course page. So I'm just going to paste in here. This is the location of my exercise number 2. I can tell it's my personal copy because it has my GitHub username at the end of it. So this looks right. And I'm just going to hit clone. Now, at this point, as expected, I'm asked for my Git credentials. So I'll put in my GitHub username. And I had my personal access token somewhere here. I had just copied this thing to have it in a convenient location. But has anybody ticked this save my login temporarily thing? Has anybody tried that? Does it? Yeah, okay. So, well, I will just hit OK at this point. So I put in my personal access token and username, and now, unlike last week, it says successfully cloned. And I can see here, for instance, my exercise number 2 folder has appeared. I presume for most people, this has not been an issue to get the copy of the exercise cloned and into the Nope My Work folder. The issues probably come more from things like when you make changes and you want to commit them and push them. So let's go here to exercise 2. Now, if I go back to the Git plugin, I can see stuff that's different from before. It recognizes basically that I'm in a Git repository folder, whereas if I was out just in the My Work folder and I go here, I get this thing that says My Work is not a Git repository. And then to use the Git, navigate to a local repository. So when I do that, go to exercise 2, now I can see some stuff I couldn't see before. Now at this point, I've just copied it straight from GitHub. There's nothing that's changed locally. So I don't see any signs of any changed files, untracked files, or anything like that. In order for something to show up here, we have to modify one of the files. And so why don't we just go here, I'll open up exercise 2. The notebook from exercise 2, and let's say, for instance, I just delete this your code here thing. So in case it's not apparent to you, I think we did mention this during last week's lesson, that every time when you come to one of these cells where you're supposed to fill something in, there will be this your code here, and you should just delete that and then modify things. In this case, it says you should create 2 lists, and we're given the names here, and I don't think I'll be giving away too much of the exercise that we would be filling in the values to these different lists here, but I won't put any values in there. I'll just leave it like this. So I've made a change. I haven't saved my notebook yet, so if I'm looking in the GitHub plugin, it doesn't show anything as having changed. But once I save this, Now I can see it says, hey, there's a file that's changed from the original copy. When I want to, say, include that file in something I would like to push to GitHub, the first thing I need to do here is click the plus button over here to stage this change, or to basically put it into that kind of rough drafts area that we talked about last time. So we had the little diagram with the 3 levels of things. This was basically the step where we did git add and then gave a file name. So this button is basically like doing git add. It puts a file into the ready to be committed list. If I decided afterwards that, well, oops, I didn't mean to put that file there, I meant to put a different one, you can click the minus from the staged area and it just drops it back down. It says still that something has changed from the original copy, but it's no longer, if I was to push changes, it's no longer included in the list of files that would be pushed. If you're working on the exercises from this week onwards, typically we have multiple notebooks. So if you had put, that you wanted to commit changes to the problem 1 notebook and you put it there, and then by accident you put the problem 2 as well, you could just click the minus button to get something out of the staged area so that you don't push a notebook you don't want to push. But in our case, I do want to push the change here to exercise number 2. And you can see when you put it into the staged area that the little text box down here gets a red outline on it. And this is where you're supposed to put the commit message. So when you commit things to GitHub, you always have to include the message saying what you did. So I could say, for instance, deleted placeholder answer text for part 1 of problem 1. Whatever. Git will tell you, for instance, on GitHub that the best commit messages are kind of short and sweet, 50 characters or less. That's a guideline. I think the most useful thing is that you actually say what you did, and you don't just say, change some stuff, or deleted text. Occasionally, you might say, like, fixed a typo, and then it's clear that with that commit message, you go and you look at the original version and the changed version, you see there's 1 comma missing. That's fairly intuitive. But if you make changes to multiple lines, you should describe what you've done so that future you, in several days could look back and see where you left off with things and say, oh, okay, right, this is the last thing I did. So I've typed in the message here. I have the file staged and ready to be committed. And then the next thing here would be to push the commit button. Now, because I haven't used this plugin yet, it's going to ask me for my name, which is, in this case, my actual first and last name, and my email address. And so those 2 things are just being asked for by Git, because whenever you make a commit, as I mentioned last week, it has to know who was the person who made this commit. This is not your GitHub information. This is just like your user information, so your name and your email address. And this goes in Git, and then I push OK, and it commits. What we've done at this point is we have basically made a little kind of checkpoint or commit of our code changes locally on the CSC Noppe system. So if I look in the history of things, for instance, in Git, I would see in the log of changes that I have made a modification to this notebook locally. Nothing has gone to GitHub yet. So this is an important thing. You might notice that when I was asked for information, I wasn't asked for my GitHub username and GitHub password because I didn't push anything to GitHub yet. But you can see the little icon up here now has the orange dot next to it, which means that there are changes that are ready to be pushed, and that's our sort of next step to change things further is I push this button, and now it comes back to this thing where it gets maybe a bit annoying that we have to type in once again GitHub username, and then I've got to go here and once again copy and paste my personal access token in order to push things up to GitHub. So I'll complete the kind of process here. We'll take a look at GitHub, and then I'll go back and review a couple things just to be clear. Okay, so I click OK to push. It says successfully pushed. That looks good. If I go back to GitHub now and I look at my exercise number 2 and refresh the page, I can now see that up here above the code is always, above the files rather, is always the last person to make a change and the commit message. So I can see my user deleted placeholder answer text for part 1 of problem 1 minute ago. And if I wanted to, I could, for instance, click on this and it will actually show me what has changed in this commit. So I just clicked, actually I think anywhere, if you click on this text for the commit message or anything like that, it will show you what's changed. That's another place where you can just say, okay, I pushed and it changed the stuff I expected to change. Because sometimes, yeah, you might include extra files you didn't mean to and you want to undo something. It's good that you can check and see what has changed. So it's the same process more or less described on the course page. If we go, for instance, to our Meet Git lesson from last time, we had this clone a repository. This is basically what we just went through. We went to the GitHub plugin, cloned, put in the name of my exercise number 2, for example, hit the clone button, and then we're prompted for the credentials like this. All of this stuff should pretty much follow what we were doing in the terminal last time, but it explains how to do it using the Git plugin, which is far more convenient than having to drop into the terminal every time you want to push changes, unless you're kind of an old person like me who likes the terminal, and that's where I still do most of my Git stuff. But the process we've just gone through is described here. One thing I wanted to check on was there is a note in here about telling Git to remember our GitHub username and access token. Has anybody tried this? Because we could try it right now and just see if it works. This worked at some point and then it stopped working, and I don't know whether we got it working again last year. I can't recall. But we could try this Git. It's basically just storing your personal access token and username so you don't get prompted every time. But we have to do this in a terminal window. But we could give it a shot. So I'm going to copy this command here, this git config global credential helper, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to store our credentials. Probably when we do this, it's going to ask for the GitHub username and personal access token when you run the command. But then perhaps this will work. If not, we can try to find a solution so you don't have to put your stuff in every time, because it should be possible to do. So let's try this. I'm going to just go back to Nope. I'm going to go to File, New, and Terminal. And paste this command in here. This looks right. So git config global credential helper, blah, blah, blah. This should basically put it inside your My Work folder in a file called .git credentials. And I think that looks a little bit funny to me, the way this text is written here. But let's try it. I don't think I wrote this, so. Okay, I ran the command. It did not give any output, which doesn't make me feel super confident that this worked. But if we go back to the exercise 2 notebook, and I'm, for instance, here in the Git plugin, I could click the button now to pull the latest changes. Okay, I'm still being asked for my Git credentials. Let's see if I type this in once, whether this then stores it afterwards. Successfully pulled. Let's try it now again. Why did it give details? Already up to date. Okay, this sort of looks like it might be working. Let's make another change. Let's delete this one. So I'll save this, stage my file, make a commit message. So deleted placeholder answer text for part 2. Commit. Committed the changes, and now if I push, successfully pushed. Seems like that works. I don't know for sure whether every time you log in it will ask you once for your credentials or whether it will keep them between sessions, but at least it seems like that is now an option. So just as a reminder, in the Meet Git lesson, it's just above the push changes to GitHub that it tells you how to do this. And then this should make the process of using this Git plugin even a little bit easier if you're not asked to type in your credentials every time. Are there questions about the Git plugin stuff? I know I kind of went through this a little bit quickly. I don't want to use too much time for today's lesson, but also since the video will be available for you, you can also go back and rewatch it on the course page if you do have issues. But are there any questions, or like for those of you who are having trouble pushing things to GitHub, did this clarify some part of the process? Okay. All right, I don't see anything urgent, so I think it's in our best interest to move forward with today's lesson. So I'll go here to the lesson 3 overview. And essentially today's lesson is about repeating tasks and making decisions in our code. And we're going to use the idea of loops in the form of a for loop, which allows us to repeat something a finite number of times in a program. And also we'll learn about these conditional statements, if, if, and else, that allow us to essentially make decisions about what parts of the code get executed. And as always, we'll do this inside of our CSC Noppe platform. And to get started, we've got to go back to the notebooks directory inside the My Work folder. So you should go there. And inside there, we need to go to the Git plugin and pull the latest changes, because there are changes that exist in the form of a new lesson 3 set of notebooks. Why does it tell me this? Okay, yeah, this is fine. So when you pull things, you should see that your lesson 3 notebook appears there. Yeah. Okay. I have a feeling I know what's going on. I'll say when you modify files inside here, it's fine to have modified versions of the files. If you commit anything in Git inside these directories, it will fail to pull repositories. I don't know whether that's possibly the issue, but if you have committed anything in the notebooks directory, this is one of the problems with the way this is set up, is that then you get this kind of conflict where it says, oh, there's local changes and there's changes on GitHub, and it doesn't know how to resolve them. Can you tell from when it says failed to pull, it gives you the little text describing what went wrong? Okay, yeah, so there must be a kind of a local commit in that directory. If you want, for those of you, if anyone else encounters this issue, the fastest solution is if you go to the My Work folder and rename this notebooks folder to be called something else, like notebooks-old. You could just like do that. And this is only if you're having the issue with failing to pull. You can rename that, and then if you go back to lesson number, let's see, was it in lesson number 1? I think it might have been in the course environment in lesson 1. In cloud computing environments, perhaps here, there was this thing about cloning the notebooks repository. So essentially, if you rename the notebooks directory to be something else, you can then clone a fresh copy from GitHub using the stuff that's in under the CSC Noppe in course environment from lesson 1 on the web page. I don't have a Discord open right now, otherwise I could drop the link directly into Discord. But basically, you just make a fresh copy, and then that should allow you to at least work on the lesson for today. If you're having trouble with it, still we can chat at the break and fix things as well. But it's this happens, and we have not found a very good solution for this problem. It's also something that we're having issues with last year. But for those of you who were able to, I'm just going to rename my notebooks to not be notebooks old. Pull the files. We're going to go here to L3 and then open up our first notebook about for loops. And then I'm just going to hide the file browser and make this one click bigger. So last week we learned about lists, and we learned how to do things like this, how to make a list of European cities. So we have here our variable called European cities, and here are the items we want to put into our list. So Helsinki, Paris, Barcelona, and Uppsala. And if I run the cell, this stores our list in memory. And with what we know, if we wanted to, we could go and take a look at what each value in our list is by using its index value. So if we want to see the first city in the list, we put an index value of 0, run the cell, and as expected, we get back Helsinki. And if I just copy this and paste it in here, change the index to number 1, we get the second item in the list. Index 2, we get the third, and index number 3, we get the fourth item. So accessing values by index, no problem. We can do that. It's a little bit clumsy, but we can do that when we want to access values. The problem is if we want to go through and check whatever, check the value of every city in here or do something with each one of these values, doing it with this approach is not a particularly good idea. And there's a few reasons for that. So if we change our list of cities, for example, to be Riga, Rome, and Athens, we can run the code cell again here. These are still European cities, but now we have a different list. And if we copy what we did above, for instance here, to access the different items in the list, okay, now we get our updated list with Riga as the first, Rome as the second, Athens as the third. And if we were to continue on with this, just using exactly the same code we had before, we have a problem here that now we're outside the range of our list by trying to access the fourth value. So if we have lists that are of different length, having something like this where we just go through and print out the values of these 4 items isn't going to work if our list has fewer than 4. Or if the list has more than 4 items, we're only going to print the first 4. We're not going to see the other ones that are in there. So doing this where you kind of make a list and then access the values by copying and pasting and changing the index value is not a very functional way to explore the items that you have in your list. And this is one example. It's kind of a silly one, but where we can use something called a loop to go through and have a more flexible way of accessing the items in a list, for example. So here we have, again, European cities. Now we've picked 4 more, so Amsterdam, Brussels, Lisbon, and Reykjavik. I run this cell to store the list in memory, and if I want to take a look at what the items are inside this list, like print them out to the screen, I can do that using a for loop where we'll go through and say for city in European cities, and we're going to do something with the things that are listed here. So we have, in what we've typed so far, this word for. City is just a variable. In is another keyword like for. And then we have our list. when you hit enter, you should see that your cursor automatically gets shifted over, and it's shifted over by 4 spaces. And we'll talk about this in just a second. But let's just print city as the text that's underneath this for command. And when you run this, you should see the 4 cities in our list get printed out to the screen. No surprises here, perhaps. But this is a much easier way and a more flexible way to be able to do this kind of operation about accessing items in the list. So that if we have, for instance, more than 4 cities, like here we have US cities, I think there's maybe 8 of them. I could run this, and I could take the for loop that we have above almost exactly. So for city in US cities, colon, and then print city. And I could run this, and now I get the 8 cities printed out to the screen. For loops are designed to work in such a way that when you give them some collection of values, they will go and access each one of the values sequentially and do something with them. In this case, it goes to each one of the cities and prints its name out to the screen, but there's lots of other ways in which you can use for loops. But let's have a look just at how they operate in terms of the syntax and basically the concept about a for loop. So the idea here is that we have this for statement. Why is this indented like this? Okay, there's some kind of funniness there, but we have the for statement, just F-O-R. This variable, oops, here can be any valid variable name. So we've been using city because what we're printing out are cities, but it could be any name. It doesn't have to be, I mean, you're free to choose what goes here. Of course, it's good to choose something that makes sense, but it is your choice. As long as it's any valid variable name, it's fine to put here. Then there's the keyword in, and the expectation is that after in, you give some kind of collection. So this could be a list, it could be a tuple, it could be an array of values. We haven't encountered arrays, and we won't in this course. But it could also be a string of characters. A text string is also considered a collection in a for loop, so you can go through and print out each character in a text string, for example. Then you have this colon character at the end of the line there. That indicates the end of your for statement. And then everything you want to do using this for loop will be indented underneath the for statement. So the way that Python does this is there's no kind of end for statement or some kind of end command to indicate you're ending a loop, but you simply indent the code underneath the for statement, and then when it goes back to normal indentation, it indicates that the for statement is finished. So what will happen here is that everything that's indented here will go through for each one of the items and do something with the value that's assigned to variable, for example. So in our case, we went through our set of these cities, the collection of cities we had, and we printed out the value of the variable city every time we went through that for loop. Why is this image missing? Okay, I think if anybody wants to fix this, you need to remove the // here. That'll make our image appear, but it's fine on the course page. You can look at it. I won't update the notebook, but yeah, so you can see here the basic syntax, and we'll get a few more examples of using for loops in a moment, but it allows us to repeat things. So we want to go through, we want to do the same operation with our variable in our list, our variables in our list, our values in the list. We can do that using a for statement. There's a few examples you could think of. In terms of everyday life, for loops might seem like something kind of unfamiliar, but for instance here, this cat is doing its daily for loop of waking up at a certain time, going back to sleep 13 minutes later, waking up whatever 7 hours later to ask for food, etc. But for us, we could think about a for loop like this for a day in my week. You might have a certain set of things you do regularly, like you wake up, maybe take a shower, eat breakfast, brush your teeth, whatever. unless you're a weirdo like my spouse who brushes her teeth before she eats breakfast, which doesn't make any sense to me. But this set of things you do is a regular set of operations that many days of the week you do the same thing. So you could think about other ways in which if you're making food, you might follow something that's a little bit like a for loop. Like every time you make this recipe, you do the same set of steps. So anytime you want to repeat things with the same set of actions, a for loop is a useful way to do that. Here, we've got these different kinds of functions that might be things you do, but this is just, in this instance, not even using the value that's assigned today, but just doing something for a set number of days in the week. You can also, of course, use the value like we did and print out the name of the city that you have in your list of cities. So the key thing is we can just repeat things multiple times, essentially as many times as we have values in some collection. And when doing this, it doesn't matter if our list has 10 items or 1,000 items. We can take the same code and use it exactly as easily. So we don't have to have 1,000 print statements. The variables in a for loop are just normal variables. So if we had, for instance, here some weather conditions, we have, I think, preview of what's coming later this fall and winter with sort of snow and freezing fog and stuff like that. But we could take this list, store it in memory just by running the cell here for weather conditions, and we could say for weather in weather conditions. And again, we'll just print out weather. Nothing new really here in terms of what we're doing with our for loop, but we print this out and here's rain, sleet, snow, freezing fog, sunny, cloudy, and ice pellets that get printed. What's the value of weather after the for loop has completed? Well, we can simply just type in the variable name weather and run this, and we can see it has ice pellets. It's a normal variable. So when you've run the for loop, each one of the items in the list gets assigned to this variable weather, and then we print it out to the screen. After the for loop is done, the last thing that was assigned to weather is still assigned to weather. So you can see, for instance, now ice pellets is still assigned to that variable. So it is in every way just a normal variable like other things we've worked with. Now, we have gone through an example of using, for instance, a list of values inside of Python list to print them out to the screen. There's another way you can use for loops, which is using the range function. This is a fairly, I would say, common use of for loops as well. And for this, we do something like for value in range 5. So range is a function. It'll have parentheses wrapping around some value. And then let's just print out what value is. So again, value is the variable that's going to get assigned to whatever the output is from this function. And when you run this, you should see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 as the values that get written out to the screen. What the range function does by default, if you give it a number, is give you a list of whole numbers starting at 0, and the list of numbers is 5 values long. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. There are some other things you can do with the range function, but if you want to repeat something 5 times, for example, using the range function is one way in which you can very easily say, I want to do this 5 times, or change it and do it 50 times. It's probably in your best interest not to make the number 500 because you're going to have like a lot of stuff to scroll through in your notebook. But of course you could do that. But the way this range function works is it just does something a finite number of times, and then you can use a for loop to then do things 5, 10, 50, whatever number of times. And as noted here, the number you put in here is the number of values that will be generated in the list of values that will be used from the range function, but it goes up to and does not include the number 5. So you get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So remember that it's going to end with that number minus 1 as the last value that gets written out. The range function itself, we haven't used this yet in Python, but you can find some help about the range function using a built-in Python function called help. I'm just going to add a cell underneath our example of the range function and just do help and then in parentheses range. The output that's in the notebook is a shortened or truncated version of the output of the help for the range function. But this is Python's built-in way to give you documentation about how functions work. So range is built into Python, and if you do help range, you can see the description here about this range function, and it shows a few examples. So range and then stop is like what we did, which is basically giving you, it's strictly speaking called a range object, but it is effectively a list, the way that we're using it, of whatever number of values you want for the range function. But you can also say, okay, I don't want to start at 0. You can give a start value. So we could start our list from 5. A stop value, and even a step. So how big of a, like, do you want to go a single number between or multiple numbers between the values that come out from the range function? So the stop value will, like it did before when we put in 5, it will go up to 5 minus 1 as the last value there. And if you give like another comma and then the step, like number 2, it would give you every other number. So if we started at 0, it would be 0, 2, 4, 6, whatever for the step. It's just how big of a space between values in there. And there's a few other things in here in the description of the range function, but the essence is that you can specify what value you want to start with, what value you want to end with, minus 1, and then how big of a step in between them. Which brings us here to our question, 2.7, following our book's question numbering. And this says, if we have a print statement like this, so for I in range something, and the something is for you to decide what goes here, print I, and this is the output that's coming out from the function. So it says 2, 5, and 8. And your task here is to select from the list of options that will be available momentarily on the polling page what you should put into this range function to get the output 2, 5, 8 when you run this for loop. So I will just quickly go here to our Pressimo thing and make this visible. You should now see the question on the polling page that looks like this, and you have 5 choices, and you are asked to select which one you think would give us the output 2, 5, 8 when you put these 3 numbers into the range function. I will maybe leave this version up like that so you can see what the question is. So yeah, take a couple moments and think about it, and we'll continue shortly. All right, well, I have to say this looks like a fairly exceptional group in the sense that we got 14 votes, and all of them here for 2, 9, 3 as the values that would go into the range function to give us the output 2, 5, 8. And yeah, this is the expected answer here. When we have the list of values being printed out that starts with the number 2, that means that the first value in there does need to be a 2 rather than 0, which is the default. Excuse me. So we have 2. Then our last value in the output is 8. And remember that when you're using this stop value in the range function, it goes up to that last value minus 1, which is why this has to be a 9 here. And because it's 2, 5, 8 going up by increments of 3, the value that goes in for the step is 3. And of course, we can test this out using our cell to enter our solution. So we could say for I in range 2, 9, 3, print I. And sure enough, we get 2, 5, 8 as the output here. Again, starting with 2, going up to 9 minus 1 as the last value, which is here, and in increments of 3. We won't use the range function that often in these kind of cases. We will use it for certain types of things, but this is one way in which you can use the range function. The main point here is just to get give you an opportunity to recognize and use that the help is available for built-in function in Python by just typing help and then the name of the function. So if we went back to where we had typed help range, we could just as easily do help print and run that one that says it's help on the built-in function print in the module called built-ins. And this one, for instance, is can be useful for certain things. Like you can see that there's a parameter here called sep that is the separator between when you run the print statement and you have list of values in there. It puts a space in between them by default. It also ends with a new line character. So when you run the print statement, you always see that it gives you a new line at the end of the print statement. But these are things where if you use the help documentation, you can figure out more about how the functions in Python work. These kind of things will make more sense, for instance, after next week when we talk about functions and how to make our own functions. But there are cases where you don't want to have a new line at the end of the print statement, or you don't want to have the values separated with a space between them or something like that, that you can modify these values when using the print function. So we could take our example here just for fun and say end equals and just put a pair of quotation marks, meaning there's nothing there, no new line character, and then you get 258 written this way, because otherwise every time it printed it would put a new line character, so you get 2 and then new line 5 and new line 8. You could also, I don't know, put ... or something like that. There's ways in which you can tinker with this print function to get it to do different things. I guess you could also do it like this, whatever. We'll learn more about how to use functions starting in next week's lesson. So you might be asking yourself, why do we use this range function? What's the point? Why are we not just taking our list and printing out the values directly? So we have a city list now from African cities that we can run the cell to store in memory. And in this case, we can use a different way of accessing our cities. So we could say for city, or actually let's do it this way, for I in range. We had this len function that tells us how many values we have in a Python list. So we could say len African cities. And then there's 2 closed parentheses because there's one for the len function, one for the range function. We could then say print, and let's make this more interesting. So let's make an F string. And we could then put in the first set of curly braces African cities. And then we'll put inside the square brackets here the index value, and we'll put in the variable I here. So this is going to give us, from our range function, for instance, the first index value would be 0, and we'll get African cities as 0. So we should expect to see Dakar as the first one that's printed out. And we could say is at index mother curly braces I in the list. Something like that. So we have a print statement here. It's an F string, so we're putting variable values inside these curly braces. And in one case, we have in here African cities with set of square brackets to indicate we want to use the index value to find values in our list. And we're going to put in the value of I there. And then say as is at index I, so this is the index value itself in the list. And when we run this, we see Dakar is at index 0 in the list. Addis Ababa is at index 1 in the list. Nairobi is at index 2 in the list, etc. This is just allowing us to go through and now use the index value to get each of the values inside of our Python list by using this combination of the range and len functions. Now, of course, we don't need to do it this way here because we have a single list. We could just directly access the values of the cities like we did earlier. But there is a reason to do this in certain cases. And this has to do, for instance, with situations where maybe you have two lists and you want to have corresponding values from each list that you want to access together. So here we have a list of cities and countries. I think these are all the sort of Nordic countries and their capital cities. So I've just run these two cells for cities and countries. And we can now access the values using a single for loop with what we just did above. So we could say for I in range, len, and we could put in cities, for example. And then we could have a print statement, which I'll do again as an F string, and say, for instance, inside here, cities, square bracket I, is the capital of, and then countries, and square bracket I. And I know I'm typing a bit quickly, so I'll give you a second to catch up. The point here is that we have two lists, and in each list we have a city and a country that are related to one another. And we want to go through and say, okay, index the values at index 0 in both lists, I want to access at the same time. Then the values at index 1 in both lists, I want to access at the same time. And by doing that, with our for loop, we have going over the range length of cities. So this should give us 5 values, and which means our value of I should be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can then go to index 0 of cities and get Helsinki is the capital of. Countries at index 0 would be Finland. So when we run this, we get Helsinki is the capital of Finland, Stockholm is the capital of Sweden, Oslo is the capital of Norway, Reykjavik is the capital of Iceland, and Copenhagen is the capital of Denmark. So all of those things can be kind of matched with each other inside the list, which is one of the ways in which you might use this kind of construct when you're writing programs in Python, is when you have lists that have related values, latitude and longitude, for example. If you have a list of both of those things, often you want those to be linked to one another. You might have latitude, longitude, and elevation, and you want all 3 of those values to be linked. This is an easy way to loop over them and make sure you're getting the corresponding index in each one of the lists when you are accessing those. So that's the reason to introduce this for range, len, whatever combination, because it is one of the ways in which people use these for loops quite regularly. Now, we have another question here. Before we go to this question, I was just going to ask you folks, are there questions from you about these for loops, about the range, len combination, or anything like that? Can't get a very good read on faces in terms of how well people are understanding the idea here, but does this make some sense in terms of like what we can use for loops for and why we might want to use certain combinations like range and len together? Are there anything on your mind that are kind of questions or concerns at this point? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of things in Python, there's more than one way to solve it. So you can also zip lists together to be able to access the values with a single sort of, you can iterate through them and access pairs of values using zip function as well. So it's a very similar idea, but it just sort of does some of this stuff in the background for you. And yeah, I think you can, I don't know for zipping, I think you can zip together multiple, like more than 2 lists as well. So that's an alternative way to doing it. I think that this, at least personally, is a little bit more intuitive, but the zip function works almost exactly the same. It just, it does this kind of combination of putting the 2 lists, linking them to each other for you. But yeah, good question. Thanks. Other questions or things at this point? Okay, if not, let's do it like this. I'll put the question visible here in Pressimo. So what output this program would produce. And so now we have a list of odd numbers. That's 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. And a list of even numbers, 10, 4, 6, 8, and 2. And then we have a for loop. For I in range, len odd numbers, print odd numbers of I, plus even numbers of I. And your question to answer is what output you would see on the screen if you ran this for loop. And you can choose from the options visible here in Pressimo what you would expect to see written out to the screen. And why don't we do this as a kind of combination? You can answer this question and we'll take a 10-minute break at the same time. So you can do it now or you can come back and answer it. But we'll continue at 10:38, so it's 10:28 now. So in 10 minutes, we'll continue. And in the meantime, if you can answer this question, that would be good.